The prince scorned the girl covered in mud, but when he discovered her true identity, before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The morning broke grey and heavy over the Yorkshire moors. The hunt had been delayed by the rain, but Prince Edward of Lancaster refused to abandon it. He rode ahead of his men, his cloak already soaked, his boots spattered with mud. The air smelled of wet earth and wind. Behind him, the guards followed in a long, uneven line, their laughter echoing through the mist. Edward barely heard them. He needed movement, anything to silence the dull restlessness that haunted him. The endless duties, the endless flattery, the endless sense that nothing in his life truly belonged to him. Out here, at least, he could pretend he was free. A sudden shout from one of the riders broke the rhythm. "Your Highness, someone on the road." Edward slowed his horse. Through the fog he saw a cart stuck in the mud. A single figure struggled beside it, a woman trying with all her strength to pull the wheel free. Her dress clung to her body, heavy with rain, her hair loose and dark against her face. She looked more like a ghost than a living soul. The prince frowned. "What is she doing here?" The guard shrugged. "A peasant, most likely, lost her way." Edward urged his horse closer. The woman didn't turn to look at him until he spoke. "You there, step aside, you block the road." Her hands froze on the cart's rim. Slowly she lifted her head. Her face was streaked with mud, her eyes an unfamiliar shade of grey. But there was nothing humble in her gaze. It was calm, steady, and proud. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said, her voice low but clear. "The road is not yours alone." A murmur rose among the guards. Edward's brow arched. "Not mine? These lands belong to the crown." "Then I stand upon the king's road," she answered, "and I do no harm in crossing it." Her tone, polite yet firm, stung his pride. The men behind him laughed softly. The prince's temper flared, less from anger than from surprise. "You speak boldly for one in your state," he said. "Do you often forget your place?" The woman met his eyes without flinching. "I know my place better than most, Your Highness. Mud washes off. Arrogance does not." A silence fell over the road. Rain tapped against the prince's gloves. One of the guards gave a nervous cough. Edward's lips curved into a faint smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "You are insolent," he said quietly, "and brave. I'll grant you that." He leaned forward in the saddle, studying her. There was something in her face that stirred a strange memory, though he could not name it. But pride would not allow him to linger. He gave a sharp nod. "Let her be," he told his men. "The crown is generous today." Laughter broke out again as he spurred his horse forward. Mud splashed across the woman's skirt as they rode past. She did not move, did not bow, did not call after him. Only when the echo of hooves faded did she whisper to the empty road, "One day, Your Highness, you will wish you had not spoken." That night, Edward could not sleep. The rain had not stopped beating against the palace windows. His valet brought him wine and tried to make conversation, but he waved the man away. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, her face streaked with mud, her steady gaze, her words cutting through his pride. He told himself it was irritation. No woman had ever dared speak to him in that tone, yet irritation did not explain the weight in his chest, nor did it explain why at dawn he summoned his steward. "Find her," he said simply. "The woman from the road yesterday. I want to know who she is and where she came from." The steward looked startled. "Your Highness, there are hundreds of villages in that region. Do you recall her name?" "I did not ask," Edward replied, "but I expect you to discover it." The man bowed and left. Edward walked to the window, watching the mist lift over the palace gardens. Somewhere in those endless hills, a woman had spoken to him without fear, and he could not forget her voice. 3 days passed before word returned. The steward entered the library, pale and uneasy. "Your Highness, I questioned every cottage within 20 miles. None have seen a woman matching the description. It is as though she vanished into the earth." Edward frowned. "Vanished?" "Impossible." The steward hesitated. "There was an old woman near Ashford village who claimed to have sheltered a traveller 2 nights ago. A young lady, worn and hungry, with a manner far too refined for her station. But she left before dawn." "Did she give her name?" "No, Your Highness. Only that she had far to go." Edward turned away, his hands clasped behind his back. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did not touch him. "Continue your search," he said. Discreetly. The days that followed were restless. He went through the motions of his duties, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His mother, the Queen, noticed his distraction at supper. You seem troubled, Edward, she said gently. Has the council wearied you again? He smiled faintly. Nothing of importance, Mother. She studied him. When your father was young, he too believed the world should bend to his will. Life taught him otherwise. Be careful that pride does not blind you to the lessons before you. He gave no answer. Yet her words lingered. That night he dreamt again of the woman, standing in the rain, her face turned to him, eyes unbroken by fear. By the end of the week, the steward returned once more, this time carrying a folded paper sealed with wax. Your Highness, he said quietly, a letter arrived from an informant in the north. It concerns the woman. Edward broke the seal impatiently. His eyes moved over the words. Then he read them again, slower. The letter said only, Your Highness, the woman you met bears the mark of House Ashford. The name struck Edward like a sudden blow. House Ashford. He read the words again, uncertain whether to believe them. Ashford, one of the oldest and most loyal families of the Crown, extinguished 6 years ago in a carriage accident on the road to York. The Duke, his wife, and their only daughter, Eleanor. The tragedy had filled the newspapers for weeks. No survivors had been found. Edward paced the floor, the letter crushed in his hand. Could the woman in the rain be that same child, now grown and risen from the shadows of the past? It was impossible, and yet the thought refused to leave him. He remembered the poise in her stance, the way her voice carried the calm assurance of breeding. A peasant could not speak like that. At dawn, he summoned his steward again. Send word to the Minister of the Interior, he ordered. I want confirmation, quietly. By the week's end, confirmation came, and it was truth. Lady Eleanor Ashford had indeed survived the accident. The carriage had plunged into a river, her parents drowned, but she had been found by a shepherd's wife downstream. The woman, fearing the child would be taken from her, had raised her in secrecy. Now, by chance or providence, her identity had been discovered through a birthmark, an insignia of the Ashford line. When the news reached the king, all England stirred. The lost heiress was to be restored to her title and property. The court prepared to receive her, and Edward, who had once mocked her as a peasant, found himself restless, almost afraid. The day of her presentation came beneath a cloudless sky. The great hall of Lancaster Palace was filled with lords and ladies whispering behind fans. Edward stood beside his father, his pulse unsteady. Then the herald's voice rang out. Lady Eleanor Ashford. She entered with quiet grace, clothed in pale silk, her hair drawn back simply, a single ribbon at her throat. No jewels, no display. Yet she needed none. The room fell still. The girl who had faced him in the rain now walked as though she had been born to command. Her eyes found his for an instant, calm and unreadable, and he felt his throat tighten. When she curtsied before the king, her voice was steady. Your Majesty, I am honored to stand once more among your subjects. The king smiled kindly. England rejoices at your return, my dear. May you find peace in the home your parents built. Edward could bear it no longer. As the gathering dispersed for supper, he crossed the room. Lady Eleanor, he said softly. She turned. Your Highness. Her tone was polite, her smile faint. Not a trace of recognition, though he knew she had not forgotten. I believe we have met, he said. Some weeks ago on the northern road. I recall the road, she replied. And the rain, and the man who wronged you. Her gaze did not waver. I remember a prince who mistook mud for worth. But time has a way of correcting errors, does it not? He winced. If words could undo what was done, I would speak them now. But they cannot, she said gently. And there is no need. I survived well enough. She inclined her head and walked away. The scent of her, faint lavender and rain, lingered long after she was gone. That night, Edward's friend Lord Halford found him in the gallery. You look as though you've seen a ghost, he said. Perhaps I have, Edward murmured. Halford raised an eyebrow. Lady Eleanor is remarkable. There's talk she may soon restore the Ashford estate. The court adores her already. Yes, Edward said bitterly. They adore what they once pitied. Halford studied him. You seem affected. Wouldn't you be? Edward asked. If the woman you insulted before half your guard turned out to be a duke's daughter. Halford gave a low whistle. Then she remembers. She remembers, Edward repeated, staring out into the night, and she will not forgive. In the days that followed, Eleanor became the center of every gathering. Invitations poured in. The king himself expressed delight in her composure and intelligence. She moved through the court like a calm current, untouched by vanity, untouched by malice. Edward watched her from afar, torn between admiration and regret. At one reception, he found the courage to approach again. She stood near a window speaking with Halford. Her laughter was soft but rare, and Edward felt a spark of envy at the sight. "May I join you?" he asked. Halford bowed. "Of course, Your Highness." Eleanor inclined her head. "We were speaking of the countryside. Lord Halford tells me you often ride there." "I do," Edward said. "The moors are beautiful after rain." Her eyes met his. "I would not know. The last time I rode in the rain, the company was unkind." Halford looked between them, sensing tension. "I will fetch refreshments," he said quickly, and left. Edward exhaled. "You mean to punish me forever, then?" "Punish?" she repeated softly. "No. Punishment implies anger. I simply remember." He stepped closer. "You cannot think me proud still. I have sought you for weeks." "Why?" she interrupted. "Because your conscience stirs? Or because the woman in mud has become worth your notice?" Her words stung more than he wished to show. "Because I was wrong," he said quietly, "and because something in me changed that day." She studied him, uncertain, then turned away. "Change is a fine word, Your Highness. Yet men of your rank speak of it as they do the weather. It passes." He reached out, then stopped himself. "You will see otherwise." She gave no answer, and when he looked again, she had slipped away into the crowd. The next morning, gossip spread through the palace corridors. Some whispered that the prince had quarreled with the new heiress. Others claimed he was smitten. The courtiers delighted in the scandal. Eleanor endured it in silence. She neither encouraged nor denied the talk, but the faint colour in her cheeks betrayed unease. Her aunt, the Duchess Beatrice, took notice. "My dear," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, "you must tread carefully. A prince's admiration is a dangerous gift. His affection can raise you high, or ruin you entirely." "I do not seek his affection," Eleanor replied. "Perhaps not, but he seeks yours." Eleanor turned to the flames. "If he does, he will tire of it soon enough." Beatrice smiled thinly. "Then it is fortunate I have other plans." "You cannot remain unattached, child. The Ashford name must be secured again." "I have spoken with Lord Halford." Eleanor looked up, startled. "Lord Halford? A good man, respected, loyal to the crown. He has expressed admiration for you, and he is willing to offer marriage." Eleanor hesitated. "I hardly know him." "You will," her aunt said firmly. "Do not let sentiment cloud reason. You owe it to your family to restore its standing." That night, Eleanor sat alone at her window. Beyond the gardens, the palace lights shimmered. She thought of Edward, of his voice, his restless eyes, his sudden humility. Yet she also remembered the laughter, the humiliation, the cold rain on her skin. Her heart would not forgive so easily. Days later, the court assembled for a grand dinner in honor of the king's birthday. The hall was brilliant with candles, the air thick with perfume and chatter. Edward entered late, his gaze immediately seeking Eleanor among the guests. She sat near her aunt, radiant yet distant, her face unreadable. As the meal progressed, the Duchess Beatrice rose from her seat. Her voice carried easily across the hall. "Your Majesty," she said with a practiced smile, "if I may take a moment to share happy news." The king gestured kindly. "Of course, Duchess." She turned to the crowd. "It is with great joy that I announce the engagement of my beloved niece, Lady Eleanor Ashford, to the Honourable Lord Halford." The hall fell silent. A murmur rose, rippling through the assembly. Edward froze, the goblet in his hand trembling. His eyes found Eleanor's. She looked pale, stunned, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Halford rose politely, bowing to the Duchess, then to Eleanor. "I am honoured beyond measure," he said. Eleanor forced a faint smile. "Your kindness humbles me, my lord." Edward's jaw tightened. He set his goblet down too quickly. The wine spilled across the tablecloth. "A happy occasion indeed," he said, his voice controlled. "May the union bring peace to both families." The king nodded approvingly, unaware of the tension beneath the words. "Well said, Edward. Lord Halford is a fine man." Edward managed a stiff bow and left the table. The corridor outside was cold and silent. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. The image of Eleanor's face haunted him, resigned, unsteady, as though the announcement had caught even her by surprise. Behind him, a soft voice spoke. "You did not congratulate me." He turned. Eleanor stood there, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Was I expected to?" he asked. "Courtesy demands it." "Courtesy," he echoed bitterly. "And what of truth?" "The truth," she said, "is that my aunt believes this will restore the Ashford name. Lord Halford has been kind, and I will not dishonor him. Do you love him?" Her silence was answer enough. He stepped closer. "Then why accept?" "Because I have learned what comes of pride," she whispered. "And I will not risk ruin again for the favor of a prince." His voice dropped. "You think I seek to ruin you. I think you seek redemption," she said, "and I cannot give it." For a long moment they stood facing each other, the echo of laughter from the hall drifting faintly behind them. Then she turned away, her shoulders trembling. He reached for her hand but stopped short, his fingers brushing air. "Eleanor," he said softly, "this is not the end of it." She did not look back. It must be. Her steps faded down the corridor, leaving him alone with the sound of his own heartbeat. At that very moment in the hall beyond, the Duchess Beatrice raised her glass once more and smiled toward the guests. Her voice rang clear and smooth. "To the future Lord and Lady Halford," she declared, "may their union strengthen the crown and silence every whisper." And across the crowded room, the prince's empty chair stood as the only sign of defiance left in the hall. The engagement dominated every corner of court life. Everywhere Edward went, he heard her name whispered, always followed by Lord Halford's. The talk was full of admiration. How noble, how dutiful, how fitting for a lady restored from tragedy. No one mentioned her eyes the way they dimmed when Halford spoke, or the silence that fell whenever Edward entered a room. But he noticed everything. Halford remained gracious as ever. One morning Edward found him in the stables, tightening a saddle. "You ride early," Edward said. Halford smiled faintly. "A man soon to marry must clear his thoughts. You should try it." "I have," Edward replied. "It changes nothing." Halford studied him. "You disapprove." "I envy," Edward admitted. "But not you. Her peace. She has built a wall I cannot cross." Halford's hands stilled. "She has suffered more than most. My wish is to give her safety, not passion." "And what if she desires passion?" Halford gave a small, sad smile. "Then she will not find it with me." Edward looked at him sharply. "You love her." "Yes," Halford said simply, "but I know she does not love me. I am content to protect her name." Edward turned away, torn between gratitude and despair. "You are a better man than I, Halford." "Perhaps," Halford said softly, "but not the one she wants." That evening, the palace glittered with light for the masquerade in honor of Lady Eleanor's betrothal. The corridors filled with laughter and music. Masks of gold and silver flashed beneath chandeliers. Edward arrived late, his mask dark, his mood darker. He had sworn to stay away, yet some force stronger than pride drew him there. He saw her almost at once. Eleanor wore a gown of pale blue, her mask trimmed in pearls. The crowd parted for her, as if by instinct. Halford stood beside her, ever composed, his expression unreadable. Edward's pulse quickened. When the musicians began a slow waltz, he approached. "May I claim one dance?" Halford inclined his head. "If the lady permits." Eleanor hesitated. "One dance only, Your Highness." They moved to the center of the floor. The room seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythm of their steps and the quiet sound of breath. Edward held her lightly, afraid she might vanish if he drew closer. "I did not expect to see you tonight," she said. "I did not expect to come," he answered, "but I could not stay away. Habit is a dangerous master, Your Highness." "And what of memory?" he asked. "Does it command you too?" Her eyes flickered beneath the mask. "Memory warns me. Once I trusted appearances and they betrayed me." "I am not the same man," he said. "Then prove it," she replied softly. "But not to me, to yourself." They turned again, the music swelling. Around them, laughter echoed, but their silence was louder. When the dance ended, she stepped back, curtsied, and left him standing alone. Moments later, a voice at his shoulder made him turn. Duchess Beatrice, smiling behind her jeweled mask. "Your Highness," she said sweetly. "Such a picture you make. Our gallant prince, our radiant niece. The gossip will be dreadful." He met her gaze coldly. "You seem fond of gossip, Duchess. It can be useful," she said. "Say especially when one must protect family interests. My niece's engagement must not be jeopardized by sentiment." He clenched his jaw. "You think I would harm her reputation?" "I think you already have," she said, lowering her voice. "Your attentions are noticed. The court watches. End it, Your Highness, or I will." Before he could reply, she glided away, leaving behind the faint scent of roses and threat. Eleanor spent the next days avoiding him. When their paths crossed, she smiled politely, spoke briefly, and disappeared. The more she withdrew, the deeper his frustration grew. Finally, he sought her in the gardens, where he found her walking alone. "You hide from me," he said. "I keep peace," she answered without turning. "Peace," he repeated bitterly. "Do you find it in silence?" She faced him then, eyes bright with restrained emotion. "You do not understand what your presence costs me. The court whispers. My aunt warns. And you—" he said. "You make me remember," she said quietly. "The rain, the laughter, the shame. And now I must smile and pretend it never was." He stepped closer. "Would you rather I forget you entirely?" "Perhaps I should wish that," she whispered. "But I cannot." The words broke something between them. For a long moment they stood, close enough to hear each other's breath, yet neither moved. Then footsteps sounded nearby, and she drew back sharply. "Go," she said, "before someone sees." "I will not live in shadows, Eleanor. Then you will live in scandal." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away and fled toward the palace, her gown brushing the gravel in hurried rhythm. By evening, the gossip had doubled. Whispers of secret meetings and fading loyalty reached every ear. Duchess Beatrice watched with narrowed eyes. That night, she visited Lord Halford privately. "My dear lord," she said smoothly, "it seems the prince grows too attentive. I fear for my niece's peace of mind." Halford listened in silence. "The prince's feelings are his own affair." "Yet they may cost her everything," Beatrice said. "If he ruins her reputation before the wedding, the crown will not protect her. You must act, my lord." "What would you have me do?" "End it," she said simply, "before she forgets her duty." Halford bowed. If that is her wish, she need only say it. The next morning, he found Eleanor in the library. She greeted him with warmth, unaware of her aunt's visit. "Lord Halford," she said, "I was about to send for you. We have much to discuss about the estate." He stopped her gently. "Eleanor, forgive me. I must speak first." She looked at him, puzzled. "Of course. I know you agreed to marry me for your family's sake," he said, "but I cannot hold you to a promise that was never born of affection." Her breath caught. "You misunderstand." "No," he interrupted kindly. "I understand too well. Your heart is elsewhere. I have seen it in your eyes." Tears filled her lashes. "You are too generous." "I am merely honest," he said. "You deserve a love that trembles when you enter the room. I will not be the man who denies you that." She took his hand, her voice trembling. "You will always have my gratitude and my respect." He smiled. "Then that is enough." When he left, she sat motionless for a long time. The freedom she had thought she wanted now frightened her. Without the shield of engagement, she stood exposed to every eye and to her own heart. That night the palace prepared for another celebration, a gathering of foreign envoys. Eleanor attended only at the king's insistence. She wore no jewels, only a simple white gown, her face pale but serene. Edward saw her from across the room and knew something had changed. She carried herself with quiet resolve, neither timid nor proud, but free. He crossed to her. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, "you look different." "I am," she said. "Lord Halford has released me from our engagement." His heart leapt. Did he tell you why?" "Yes," she replied. "He said I deserved love." Edward swallowed hard. "He is right." "Is he?" she asked. "And what do you believe I deserve, Your Highness?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that I deserve nothing. Yet I would spend my life earning your forgiveness." Her breath caught, but before she could answer, a sharp voice broke through the crowd. Duchess Beatrice stood beside the king, her smile bright and cold. "Your Majesty," she called, "it seems we have a story unfolding tonight. Perhaps your son will enlighten us all?" The room fell silent. Edward turned, his blood running cold. "Duchess, I beg your pardon?" She stepped forward, her fan snapping shut. "It grieves me to speak, but truth demands it. The Prince of Lancaster has been meeting my niece in secret. His attentions, though perhaps well-meant, have placed her honor in jeopardy." Gasps rippled through the hall. Eleanor went white. Edward felt the weight of every eye upon him. "That is a lie," he said evenly. "My respect for Lady Eleanor is beyond question." "Respect," Beatrice said sweetly. "Then why the secrecy? Why the late walks, the whispers in the garden?" The king's face hardened. "Edward, is there truth in this?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Your Majesty, if there is fault, it is mine. The prince acted with nothing but honor." Beatrice turned sharply. "Eleanor!" But Edward raised a hand. "No, Duchess, enough. You have done your damage. If my name is to be tarnished, let it be by my own words." He faced the king, his tone steady. "Yes, I sought her. I wronged her once, long ago, and I have sought forgiveness ever since. That is the only truth." Murmurs spread through the court like wind through dry leaves. The king sighed heavily. "You have shamed the crown, Edward. Return to London. We will speak no more of this here." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Your Majesty." But the king raised a hand. "Enough, child, you must rest. The court will forget in time." Edward bowed stiffly. "As you command, father." Without another glance, he turned and left the hall. The doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed like judgment. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding. Around her the whispers began again, faint, cruel, relentless. Duchess Beatrice laid a hand on her arm. "You see what comes of pride, my dear. A prince's favor is a perilous gift." Eleanor drew away, her voice breaking. "You have destroyed his name and mine alike." "I have protected what remains," Beatrice replied coolly. "You will thank me when the scandal fades." But Eleanor no longer heard her. She fled the hall, her steps echoing through the marble corridor until they were lost in silence. In his chamber, far from the noise of celebration, Edward stood by the window, staring at the rain beginning to fall once more. His reflection stared back, proud and broken all at once. He thought of her face, pale, defiant, betrayed. The door opened quietly. Halford entered, his expression grim. "I tried to reason with them," he said. "The king will not relent." Edward turned. "He commands me to London." "I know." "Then this is how it ends," Edward said. "A mistake born of arrogance, finished by deceit." Halford placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not finished, only begun. The truth has a way of returning, like rain." Edward looked out once more at the storm spreading across the horizon. That night, the royal carriage departed for London under heavy clouds, its wheels cutting through the mud of the same northern road where the story had begun. The winter in London was harsher than any Edward remembered. The city was grey, wind biting through the narrow streets, and even the palace felt colder, stripped of its grandeur. Days passed in long silence, filled with hollow meetings and polite avoidance. He attended councils, wrote letters, stood beside his father at ceremonies, and all the while his mind returned to one face, the one he had driven away. He thought of Eleanor in Yorkshire, surrounded by whispers and betrayal. He imagined her walking through the empty halls of the Ashford estate, once again alone as she had been before her name was restored. Every attempt to forget her only deepened the ache. At last, he could no longer bear the weight of his inaction. One evening he sought an audience with the king. His father looked up from a stack of letters. "You are restless, Edward." "Sit." Edward obeyed. "Father, I cannot remain silent about what happened in Yorkshire. Lady Eleanor's name was dragged through scandal because of lies. She deserves truth, not disgrace." The king sighed. "You speak of her often. Do you love this girl?" Edward hesitated. "I do not know what name to give it, but it is the only thing that feels real." The king's voice softened. "Then you must learn the difference between feeling and duty. England's eyes are upon you. A prince cannot choose for himself. I am not asking your permission to choose, Edward said quietly. I am asking for the chance to make amends. The king studied him for a long time. Go then. But remember, redemption is earned by deeds, not words. Within 2 days, Edward left London without escort. He rode north through frozen fields, the air sharp with mist. The journey seemed endless, each mile heavy with regret. When at last the Ashford estate appeared through the trees, he halted at the gates. The grand house stood quiet, windows shuttered against the cold. The servant who opened the door stared at him in shock. Your Highness. I seek Lady Eleanor, Edward said. She is at the chapel, Your Highness. She goes there each morning. He nodded, dismounted, and walked across the frosted lawn toward the small stone chapel that overlooked the valley. The wind was fierce, his breath a cloud before him. Through the open door he saw her kneeling, head bowed. For a moment he simply watched her, unsure if he had the right to speak. Then quietly he stepped inside. She turned at the sound of his boots against the floor. For an instant disbelief crossed her face, then caution. Your Highness. Eleanor, he said. Do not call me that. Not here. She rose slowly. You should not have come. I had to. There is nothing left to say. There is everything left, he said. I left you to face shame I caused. I will not do it again. Her hands trembled at her sides. Your father forbade you to return. He told me to earn redemption, Edward replied. And I intend to. She shook her head. You cannot change what has been done. I can face it, he said. And I can face you. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. Do you know what it is to be laughed at by those who once pitied you? To be told you should be grateful for survival, as though life itself were a favor? He stepped closer. Yes, he said. Now I do, because I have become a man mocked for his mistakes. The prince who bowed to pride and lost everything worth having. Her eyes glistened. Words are easy, Edward. Then let my actions speak. He dropped to one knee, not in ceremony but in truth. You said once that arrogance cannot wash away. Let me prove it can. She stared at him, shaken. Please, rise. You are the heir to a throne. He looked up at her. And you are the only person before whom I wish to kneel. Her breath caught. Why do you do this? Because I love you, he said simply, and because I would give up the crown before I lose the chance to be forgiven. The words hung in the cold air. She turned away, her voice barely a whisper. Love cannot erase humiliation. I may forgive you, but I can never forget. I do not ask you to forget, he said. Only to let me begin again. She shook her head slowly. What you ask is impossible. He rose, his voice quiet but steady. Then I will find a way to make it possible. Her eyes met his, uncertain, torn between anger and something gentler. You cannot mend pride with promises. I will not mend it, he said. I will destroy it. If I must stand before the whole of England to do so, I will. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned toward the altar, her hands clasped. You speak as though the world listens to you. It will, he replied, but not as its prince, as a man who wronged a woman and will right it. She faced him again. You would defy your father, the court, all of England. Yes, he said, for you. Her voice trembled. Then you are a fool. Perhaps, he said softly, but a fool who finally knows the worth of what he lost. She looked at him for a long time. Then slowly she said, If you truly mean this, do nothing for me in secret. Do it where all can see. He nodded once. Then I will. The chapel fell silent except for the wind. She turned back toward the window, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed. You should go now. If anyone sees you here, it will only cause more harm. He hesitated. Will you forgive me? I do not know, she said, but I no longer wish to hate you. That small mercy was enough. He bowed his head, then left her standing in the grey light of morning. The next day, Eleanor found her aunt waiting in the drawing room. Duchess Beatrice's expression was sharp. You had a visitor, she said. Eleanor met her eyes calmly. Yes. The prince came to speak truth. Beatrice's voice rose. Truth? He has destroyed your reputation. Will you let him finish it? Eleanor's composure did not falter. Perhaps reputation is worth less than honor, aunt. Beatrice gave a dry laugh. Honor does not feed families or save estates. No, Eleanor said, but it saves souls. The Duchess stared at her in disbelief. You have become sentimental. I have become free, Eleanor replied. When Beatrice swept from the room, furious, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe for the first time in months. Meanwhile, Edward returned to London and went straight to the palace. He asked to see the king but was told His Majesty was attending Parliament. So Edward waited until the following day, when the entire court gathered for the spring session. The hall was crowded, every noble and minister in attendance. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down like stone. When his father began the proceedings, Edward stepped forward. Your Majesty, he said clearly. Before we begin, I must address this assembly. The king frowned. This is not the time, Edward. It must be, he said, because the time for silence has passed. The murmur of voices stilled. Every gaze turned toward him. Edward stood tall, though his heart pounded. Months ago, he began, I wronged a woman of this kingdom. I mocked her for her appearance, unaware that she was of noble birth, but that truth is no excuse. When she was restored to her rightful name, I sought her forgiveness, not as a prince, but as a man. Yet my actions brought her only pain. The fault is mine alone. A ripple of astonishment moved through the chamber. The king's expression darkened. Edward, stop this. I cannot, Edward said. I would rather lose every title than bear false honor. I have spoken with Lady Eleanor Ashford, and I wish all to know that I will stand by her name until it is free from every stain I caused. The Queen rose, her voice trembling. Edward, what are you saying? I am saying, he said quietly, that I will not marry for alliance or power. I will marry for truth. A collective gasp filled the air. The king's hand tightened on the armrest. Do you realize what you are declaring? I do, Edward said, and I accept the cost. He turned to the assembly. Let England remember that nobility is not a matter of birth, but of heart. Let it begin with me. For a moment silence reigned. Then Lord Halford rose from his seat. Your Highness speaks with courage, he said, and as one who knows Lady Eleanor, I can attest. She is worthy of the crown's respect. Several voices murmured agreement. The Queen wiped her eyes. The king's sternness began to waver. You have risked much for this confession, he said at last. But perhaps it is time the court remembered that humility strengthens a throne more than pride ever could. Edward bowed deeply. Then I am content. Later, when the hall emptied, the king approached him privately. You have made your point, my son. What will you do now? Edward's answer was simple. Return to Yorkshire. There is one more truth I must speak. The next morning, he set out once again for the north. The journey felt different now, lighter, though he carried the weight of uncertainty. When he reached the Ashford chapel, he found Eleanor there again, as though she had never moved. She turned as he entered. You came back? Yes, he said. To tell you what I did. She looked at him curiously. What have you done? I stood before the court and spoke your name, he said. I told them the truth. Every word. My father knows. All of England knows. Her breath trembled. You would risk everything for me? For us, he said, if such a thing is still possible. Her eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. Edward, what you have done is beyond anything I could have imagined. I did not do it for glory, he said. I did it to give back the dignity I stole. She stepped closer, her voice unsteady. And now what will you do? He smiled faintly. Whatever you ask of me. She hesitated, caught between fear and hope. Then go, she whispered at last. Let me think. He nodded once and turned toward the door. As he reached it, her voice stopped him. Edward, she said softly, you spoke of love before. Do you still mean it? He faced her. More than ever. Then prove it, she said. Not with vows or promises, but with patience. He bowed his head. As you wish. And as he stepped out into the pale light, the first drops of spring rain began to fall, soft and steady against the stones. The weeks that followed were a quiet storm. The scandal that had once filled every corridor of London now began to fade. The story of the prince who had stood before Parliament and confessed his faults turned from shame to legend. Newspapers praised his courage. The people, once amused by his arrogance, now admired his honesty. But none of that mattered to Edward. What mattered was a single unanswered question. Would Eleanor forgive him? He wrote to her but received no reply. Still, he waited. He spent his mornings walking through the gardens of Lancaster Palace, his evenings in silence. The Queen watched him with gentle concern. "You have done all that a man can do," she said one night. "If she loves you, she will return." He smiled faintly. "And if she does not? Then you will still have her respect," she said. "But I think you underestimate her heart." 3 weeks later, a messenger arrived from Yorkshire. Edward tore open the letter with trembling hands. The words were brief, written in Eleanor's clear, steady hand. "I will come to London for the spring ceremony. If you wish to speak, you will find me there." The ceremony was to mark the beginning of the new parliamentary season, a grand affair, attended by nobles, ministers, and foreign guests. Edward spent the days leading up to it restless, torn between hope and fear. When the morning finally came, the palace buzzed with music and colour. He stood beside his father in the great hall, greeting dignitaries, pretending composure he did not feel. Then, through the shifting crowd, he saw her. Eleanor entered without fanfare. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her hair loose over her shoulders. No jewels, no crown, no symbol of rank, only quiet grace. Conversation faltered as she walked. The nobles who had once whispered now bowed. She stopped a few paces before the royal dais and curtsied. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear. "I thank you for your kindness." The king inclined his head. "England is honoured by your presence, Lady Ashford." Her eyes lifted to Edward. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled faintly and moved to stand among the guests. The speeches began. Ministers droned about policy and commerce, but Edward barely heard them. He watched Eleanor instead, the calm strength of her bearing, the way she stood unshaken amid the opulence that had once mocked her. When at last the king rose to close the session, Edward stepped forward. "Father," he said quietly, "before we conclude, may I speak?" The king hesitated, then nodded. "You may." Edward turned to face the hall. "I have spoken before of honour and humility," he began. "But today I wish to speak of gratitude." His voice carried easily, every word ringing clear. "There stands among you a woman whose courage has taught me more than any crown ever could. A woman who reminded me that true nobility is not inherited. It is earned." Eleanor's eyes widened. Murmurs rippled through the hall. The king leaned forward, but Edward continued. "Lady Eleanor Ashford," he said, "you showed me that kindness can exist even in the face of cruelty, that forgiveness is not weakness but strength. I wronged you before all England, and before all England I ask your pardon and your heart." Gasps filled the chamber. The Queen pressed a hand to her lips. Edward stepped down from the dais and crossed the floor until he stood before Eleanor. "I have laid aside pride, titles, ambition. What remains is a man who loves you. If you can look at me and still see the one who mocked you in the rain, I will leave this place and never speak again. But if you see the man who has learned to kneel in truth, then take my hand." The silence that followed was long enough for every heartbeat in the room to be heard. Eleanor's eyes shone with tears. She looked from the king to the crowd, then back to Edward. Slowly she lifted her hand and placed it in his. A collective sigh swept through the hall. Edward bowed his head over her fingers. She whispered so only he could hear, "You have done more than I thought any man could." He looked up, his voice shaking. "Then say you forgive me." "I do," she said softly, "and I love you." The hall erupted in applause. The king rose, emotion in his voice. "Let it be known that the House of Lancaster welcomes Lady Eleanor Ashford, not as a subject but as family." The ceremony dissolved into joy. The courtiers pressed forward with congratulations. Musicians began to play, yet Edward barely heard them. He led Eleanor from the hall into the gardens beyond, where the evening light turned the marble fountains gold. For the first time since the day they met, they were alone. He turned to her, still holding her hand. "I never thought this moment would come." "Nor I," she said, smiling through her tears. "You have turned mockery into memory." He brushed his thumb against her knuckles. "Do you remember the rain that day?" "I remember every drop," she said, "and the sound of laughter." "Then let me give you a new memory." The sky was pale with the last of daylight. He drew her closer, his voice low. No titles, no guards, no court. Just you and me, she nodded. Just us. He kissed her then, gently, reverently, as if the world had narrowed to the space between their hearts. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of roses. When he pulled back, she rested her head against his chest. You once said mud washes off, he murmured. You were right, but some stains remain, the kind that remind us what we've become. She smiled. And what have you become, Edward? A man who finally understands that humility is the only crown worth wearing. She laughed softly. Then wear it well. The following weeks were a flurry of preparation. The king decreed that the wedding would take place not in Westminster, as custom dictated, but at Ashford Chapel, the same small stone church where Edward had knelt before her months earlier. Eleanor tried to protest, but the Queen would not hear of it. My dear, she said, taking Eleanor's hands, your love began in that chapel. It should be blessed there too. When the day came, spring had returned in full. The fields around Ashford were green again, the sky bright with promise. People lined the road for miles to watch the royal procession pass. But within the chapel, all was simple. White flowers, sunlight through stained glass, and a quiet hum of anticipation. Edward waited at the altar, his heart unsteady. When the doors opened and Eleanor appeared, he forgot to breathe. She wore no crown, only a ribbon in her hair, the same as on that first day. Her steps were light, her eyes luminous. As she reached him, he whispered, You look like a prayer come to life. And you, she said, smiling, look like a man finally at peace. The ceremony was brief. When the priest asked if he took her hand willingly, Edward said, With all that I am. When he asked if she would stand by him through all things, Eleanor replied, I already have. When they were pronounced husband and wife, applause and bells filled the air. Outside, the villagers cheered as they stepped into the sunlight. Edward lifted her hand and kissed it before the crowd. You once told me arrogance does not wash away, he said. But love did what pride could not. She laughed through tears. And what will we do now, my husband? Live, he said. Not as prince and duchess, but as two souls who found their way through rain. That evening, a modest celebration was held at the Ashford estate. Lanterns hung from the trees and music drifted through the open windows. The king toasted their union, the queen wept softly, and even the Duchess Beatrice, subdued and watchful, offered her blessings. Lord Halford approached them with a smile. Your Highness, he said to Edward, I am glad my loss became your salvation. Edward clasped his friend's hand. You were never my rival, Halford. You were my conscience. Halford nodded, his voice kind. Then keep her heart as well as you've earned it. Later, as the music faded and the guests began to depart, Edward led Eleanor outside. The night was warm, the grass wet with dew. The stars shimmered above them. Do you remember, he asked, the night I left you in anger? I remember, she said. You rode away through the rain. He smiled. Then this is where the road ends. No, she corrected softly. This is where it begins. They walked together through the garden paths, hand in hand, saying little. The silence between them was no longer filled with pride or sorrow, but peace. At the edge of the garden stood a small fountain, its water glimmering under the moonlight. Edward stopped beside it. Every time I see rain, he said, I think of that day. So do I, she replied. But now, I remember it differently. How so? As the day I met the man who would change everything. He looked at her, wonder softening his voice. You forgive easily, she smiled. Not easily. Completely. He touched her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw. Then I will spend the rest of my life deserving that forgiveness. See that you do, she whispered. They stood like that for a long while, the night wrapping them in stillness. The sound of distant music reached them again, the faint echo of joy. Eleanor broke the silence first. You've given me back my name, my honor, and my peace. What can I give you in return? He took her hand and placed it over his heart. Your love, it is the only crown I will ever need. She laughed softly, her eyes shining. Then wear it with pride, my love. The moon rose higher, bathing them in silver light. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled faintly, a promise of rain to come. Edward turned to her with a smile that carried all the years between them. Let it rain, he said. It brought me to you once. Let it bless us again." She leaned against him, her voice tender. "It will. Every storm from now on will remind me that love can grow from the mud itself." And when the first drops began to fall, they did not run for shelter. They stood beneath the rain together, laughing, unafraid, the prince and the girl who had once defied him, now bound not by duty or title, but by the quiet, steadfast grace of love that had survived every test. Thank you so much for listening to this story, all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.